All right, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the things that will be necessary for part E of the project. So this is the last little bit to wrap it up. Essentially, it's sort of reviewing over the things that you've already done. Hopefully, this will be one of the easiest parts then. Once more, I want to stress, because it's still been a question through the whole semester, each different partner needs to have their own version of each different slide. Okay, so as an example from the very beginning of the project, here are my four imaginary partners. Each one has their own name on a slide for each different part. So as an excerpt from what would have been a larger file, 1.4 for Brian Neal, 1.4 for Neil Bryant, 1.4 for John Doe, and 1.4 for Don Joe. Remember, for each one, you want to have information here, you want to have a picture. The whole semester, hopefully you've been putting sources on or near the slides or keeping track of them somewhere, because that's a big part of what we want for this last little bit. Okay, so remember, one slide per student, one student per slide, each and every time. We've got 4 slides to go, depending on how many sources you have, I guess, for each different person. We're almost done. Okay, so now you should have your recording and your other slides above. Here we want to make sure we're submitting everything together. So this should be your whole project, everything from every partner all together. Okay, so now for part E down here, we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then again, one final video, and then it's done. Look, I can't even scroll down any further. That's the end. Okay, so if you had anything that you learned in your research that doesn't really fit anywhere else, then give some facts that you think other people might enjoy. What do you think that people might find interesting that they wouldn't have known? If there's anything else that a scientist did. So if you talked about Newton or Einstein or Bernoulli or any number of scientists, most of the famous ones have actually done several different things. So that could be something that they work on here. If they had a weird hobby or 2 thumbs or whatever, just something you find interesting, um, you know, say that here. That's your chance. Okay, once more, one student per slide, one slide per student. Make sure everybody has their own 6.1. For 6.2, talk about things that you found interesting. What did you think was the best part, or I guess maybe the worst part of the project? Don't say, "Oh, it was my partners," because that's rude. But out of the content and the process of working on the project, what did you learn compared to what you thought you were going to learn? Maybe you had Newton's second law and you thought that was going to be pretty simple, or maybe you had gravitational constant and you thought that would be relatively straightforward. What was something that was surprising to you? If you had infinite time, energy, resources, attention span, all those things, what would you want to look further into? If the project was going to go on for another 6 parts, I shudder to think about it, but if it did, what would you want to start looking into for your next parts? So, these types of things. One student per slide, one slide per student. Again, make sure everybody's got their own version of 6.2. Okay, again, you're going to notice some overlap with these. Um, you want to describe how everything went, right? What do you think was most important? What was easiest? What was hardest? What was most surprising to you? Again, this is very similar to here. This is about, facts and other things, scientists, laws, and then this can be, about the project itself. There's likely to be some overlap because the project is about finding information and, works back and forth. Again, one slide per student, one student per slide. 6.3, everybody should have their own version. All right, and then here's the big one. This is like the main deal from part E here. You should have quite a few sources from each person that you've hopefully been keeping track of. So again, maybe you put them underneath the picture at the bottom of the slide, something like that. Make sure that you find as many of those as possible, ideally all of them. That might make you have multiple slides. So don't put tiny text to make it fit all on one slide. It might need to be a couple of them. It needs to be visible, easy to read. I'm not going to check you for MLA format or APA format or any kind of fancy arrangements of those. Just if you throw down a list of websites or book names that you used, that's fine. Everybody should have different sources on there because presumably you've been using different sources along the way. So again, have a person with their name on the slide and the things that we're saying they used or ones that we attribute to them. Your picture for this, so where it says the screenshot picture, yeah, so we want the original source content. So if you used physics.com, whatever, I'm just making something up, then show a picture here of physics.com. And then, find something on the site that you found interesting, right? So if it's your scientist, and I don't know, he's holding a beaker or whatever, and I don't know, another beaker or something, whatever. If you use that somewhere in your project, then show where it was in the original context. Show the website that it came from. If it came from a book, just pick something. Something, if you talked about something way back in, I don't know, 2.3, find where that was on the website or in the book. If some of your facts that were to the side, show the stuff that went along with it. Basically prove to me that you used at least one of the sources that you listed down as your sources. And then, do that for each student, divide up the sources so that everybody has a certain number that are at least listed under them. You only need to specifically talk about one. And then everybody should talk about a different one. So if one person used physics.com and somebody else used Wikipedia, whatever, then, Britannica Online or maybe you use something from the textbook, right? So have one person talk about the textbook and then other people talk about the different websites, or maybe, I don't know, a newspaper article, whatever. I don't know how you would necessarily have found one of those, but whatever. That it's important that you find a source, talk about a source. Again, everybody should have a different one. It should all be labeled under people. And then, like always, one student per slide, one slide per student. Everybody should have a 6.4. And then, final video. This is still happening. So make sure you don't post alternate text. If it says, I don't think we have anybody named Kevin this semester. If it says Kevin's video, I can't open that. It needs to look like a link. It needs to look like a website. Because what's going to happen is I'm actually taking the code from it. There's an 11-digit, I think, or 11-character code that identifies a YouTube video. I'm actually just typing that in. I'm not even clicking on the links anyway. Technically, people could hide stuff in a link and it could go somewhere else. So, even if they did work, I wouldn't click on them anyway. I'm looking for that code. So please remember that. All right, then that should be everything. Hopefully we had successful projects and good job. Thank you.